And now I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Leadership and Development, Constructive Conflict Management. I'm going to hand things over to our featured presenter. He is an executive leadership coach and a professional development consultant, Mr. Brian Ackles. Brian, you now have the floor.
Kara, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining on this these final few days before the Christmas break. Kind of an interesting topic to bring up in December about conflict and conflict management, but this time of year stresses can tend to run a little bit high, so it is actually strangely appropriate. So let's jump into this and talk about what we're going to be discussing for the next little while. So what the goal of this webinar is to introduce you to ways to identify and manage sources of conflict, create an effective strategy to deal with conflict. We'll look at a process to manage conflict situations and how you can go from identifying conflict to conflict resolution. And we'll spend a fair bit of time talking about civility in the workplace. And it will become evident as to why this is important as we move through. So let's start off by looking at conflict. What causes conflict in the workplace? Well, there's always the issue of people. We work in various sizes of organizations. Various different people work in. They come from, your colleagues all come from different backgrounds. Not everybody gets along with everybody else. That's just a basic human truth. So there are bound to be some personality clashes that occur, and how those are handled really depends on the person, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Certainly, stress plays a huge role in interpersonal issues. The more stressed people get, the more it changes their behavior, and this is always true when you get to the ends of projects, the ends of major deliveries, when you're push for timelines. This time of year is pretty typical for increased stress in businesses. An organization that I work very closely with, my day job, if you will, we're fiscal year end at the end of December. So our finance department has a lot of stress on them to make sure that purchase orders are out, that our procurements are done, that payroll is done over Christmas. Our last pay period ends, our last payday is on the 28th of December this year. So there's a huge amount of stress on them. There's a number of big programs of work that we're working on that are coming to fruition that have to be ready for January 2nd. So that's right after the new year, and there's no time between now and then to get stuff done. So I've got a lot of people working and scrambling to get some technology in place by the end of this week, and it raises people's stress levels. So, as an organization and as part of a management team within this organization, we're working very hard to help others deal with stress in this situation. But it comes up in the way people speak and the way that they interact with each other. There's also cultural differences. And again, cultural differences can be somewhat exaggerated by the time of year. And as again, we're approaching into the holiday season, and the holidays are celebrated by different groups of people in different ways. So that can cause some stress, and those cultural differences can cause stress and can cause conflict between people. Then there's the organizational side, and the organizational issues that cause conflict. So issues with management. If management is acting in a way that is detrimental to what people feel is the right thing to do, if their management style changes and they're becoming maybe more autocratic and maybe more dictatorial than they have in the past, maybe they're suffering from stress, and that's what's coming from them. Policies and procedures can certainly be an area of conflict, especially when those policy and procedures change unexpectedly, or change without consultation, or change without a good change management process in place. Certainly workload is a huge cause of conflict within organizations, and not just too much work, but an unbalanced workload within a workplace. So if there's some groups and there's some people that are working extraordinary hours, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, and you've got groups in similar situations, but they're only working a normal work week, And that can cause some conflict between those two groups. Why are we working so hard? Why is this group not having to work as hard? So all of these things, and there's many, many, many more, but these are just some of the more common causes of conflict within organizations. Now we talk about conflict, and the first thing that comes to mind is that conflict is bad. Well, conflict is reality, so it's going to happen. You're not going to have a workplace without conflict, without some type of conflict. But there are actually some positive benefits to conflict. When a conflict situation arises, and when people work through and they deal with they deal with the conflict, and they deal with the issues, and they come to some kind of resolution, it allows people to become aware of somebody else's perspective, other people's perspective, and gain a view to how the goals of the organization can be best achieved by working together. Teams that have gone through conflict and where it's been appropriately managed and there's an appropriate resolution, tend to have a renewed sense of purpose, and their ability to work together actually increases. And there's a model called the Tuckman model, which we've heard a number of times, called forming, storming, norming, and performing. When teams get to a point where they're performing but then conflict, they tend to jump back a stage. So if it's forming, storming, norming, so they might jump back to the storming stage and have to fight amongst themselves. But then once it's resolved, their ability to work together can push them into norming, and then into performing, at even greater levels than they were in the past. And conflict between individuals helps them understand more, and again, successful resolution of conflict helps them gain a sense of what's more important. It helps them focus clearly on what their work is supposed to be. One of the other causes of conflict, of course, is stepping over your bounds and stepping into somebody else's territory. And having that sorted out and having that resolved can really invigorate people to understand that this is what I'm supposed to be doing, and this is how I'm supposed to be helping somebody else, not doing their job for them. So there are some real positive benefits here. The challenge, of course, is unresolved conflict. So what happens if you ignore it? You're a manager, you see conflict in your team, you see conflict in the organization, and you don't do anything about it. Well, productivity is going to suffer. And that's just a reality, because people are going to spend more time worrying about the conflict, fighting for their position, wondering why management isn't doing something about this, and maybe they're just thinking the management doesn't care. And if it starts getting to that point, you're going to start seeing more employee turnover in an organization. People will leave and people will find work somewhere else. And that does reflect very badly on management. The city that I live in right now on the West Coast, we're at pretty much of an all-time high of employment. They're actually using the word full employment. We're in a full employment economy. So right now we're seeing a lot of people able to move around. So if there's an organization which has a lot of unresolved conflict, people are going to leave that organization because they know they can get work somewhere else. So all of this, feeds into a very bad situation for organizations if you don't deal with conflict and resolve it. So
hey,
what is
Brian?
Yes.
Can
Yes.
you just check your microphone just a little bit? We're hearing a little bit of feedback.
Shouldn't be. I'm on the same mic I've always been on.
Okay.
Is that all right now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So what is conflict resolution? So conflict resolution is a process, and it's very important that we understand that it is a process that results in a satisfactory outcome for all the parties that are involved in a conflict. So ideally, resolution should be as a result of a collaborative agreement between the people that are having the conflict, or between the groups of people that are having a conflict. And collaboration is always going to be the best way of looking at this. And we're going to talk more about strategies, and this is really what this slide is going to come down to, is the strategies you can use to deal with conflict. But we'll get towards that more near the end of the webinar. So let's talk about the process and what a conflict resolution process really is. So having a process helps people focus on discrete steps that they can take to deal with something in a way which is repeatable. It's conflict resolution is not something which you should do in an ad hoc manner, because it's very easy to miss a step. It's very easy to go off track. And in conflict situations, emotions can be running quite high. So it's really important that we have a process. So the steps really at a very high level are to create an effective atmosphere to deal with conflict, create some mutual understanding that there is an issue and that we need to resolve it, focus on the needs of both the individuals involved, so where each person has their own particular needs, but also where their shared needs may be. Find out a root cause, find out what is actually at the bottom of this conflict. What is generating this? What is the problem? And then start looking for solutions and looking for options. And there's likely not going to be just one option that will come out of the conflict resolution process. There'll be multiple options. And from those options and from creating a good atmosphere and creating mutual understanding and shared needs, you'll be able to better manage a solution, to be able to build a solution. Now, typically as a manager, you may be facilitating a conflict resolution process with two parties. Or if you are part of the conflict yourself and you're trying to work this out with another person or another group, you can still follow this process and take the lead yourself to follow a process to get to some type of resolution which is satisfactory both for you and also for the organization. So we've talked at a very high level about the process, and we'll come back into a lot more detail about the process in a little bit. But I want to spend some time talking about civility and civility in the workplace. So conflict, as I said earlier, is inevitable. It will happen. It's just, again, it's part of human nature. Within our workplaces and within our organizations, whether they're public, whether they're private, whether they're for-profit, not-for-profit, the goal is to avoid conflict, right? Conflict, particularly where conflict is harmful to the organization. So there are a number of ways that we can create cultures and we can create atmospheres and we can create environments where we reduce the potential for conflict and we reduce the types of conflict which may occur. And this atmosphere of civility really can help this happen. And being civil in the workplace is a topic that we're going to spend a bit of time on now, because if we treat people well and if we're civil to each other, we tend to be able to avoid going into the bigger areas of conflict that can cause harm. So typically organizations have some rules in place about behavior at work. Now these rules might be codified or they might just be understood, part of the sort of underlying culture. Rules about bullying and intimidation. I mean, there are some legal challenges, there are some legal issues around this as well. Abusive language, how tolerated is abusive language in the workplace? Certainly threats and violence within the workplace. There are rules that organizations have, written rules or not, depending on the type of situation, as I said. But we need to understand what those rules are, and people need to understand and be clear on what those rules are as well. Now, there are other types of uncivil behavior which are not quite as overt, gestures. And this is where cultural sensitivity comes into play as well. And understanding that if you're working in a highly multicultural environment, a gesture in the way that you grew up and a gesture that which might seem very innocent to you might be extraordinarily rude to somebody else. So if you see somebody get very upset at a gesture that you're making, that you seem as innocent, you might want to have a chat with them, talk to this person and find out, have I offended you in some way? Did my gesture upset you? And I apologize. I find out what the cause is. Poor email and telephone management issues. Certainly poor email. Being abrupt on an email, not sending out an email which is abusive, sending out emails which are unhelpful, if you will, certainly sending out email which is inappropriate for the workplace, and I won't go further into that. but phone management as well. How do you answer the phone? Do you answer the phone? Do you not answer the phone from some people because you don't want to talk to them? What do you say when you answer the phone? Your manner in how you project and how people perceive you. My I've been answering my business phone and my personal phone pretty much the same way for likely most of my professional career. And I simply say this: "Hi, this is Brian Ackles. How can I help you?" And that to me is how I answer the phone. People expect that. Other forms of uncivil behavior, though, and this is insidious, is being late or tardiness. Not showing up to meetings, not showing up on time to meetings, walking in 4 or 5 minutes late after the meeting has started, disrupting what's going on, settling down, shuffling papers, opening your laptop, or even being in a meeting and opening your laptop and continuing to work while you're in the meeting instead of paying attention. So these are types of uncivil behaviors which can cause resentment, which can cause conflict within an organization. And we need to try and get a handle on dealing with these behaviors and managing these behaviors. So, why do we want to be civil? Well, again, we can't escape people unless you work for yourself online and don't deal with anybody else. You're going to be dealing with people. But even in that case where you're working for yourself, you still have to deal with someone who's paying the bills. You're still going to have a customer. We are linked to our coworkers, we are linked to our management, we are linked to our suppliers, we are linked to everybody in this world. I had a lunch meeting yesterday that with a colleague who I've only ever worked with on the phone, and we decided to get together for a Christmas lunch. Now, I don't know what this guy looked like, so I got to the restaurant and I'm sitting in the bar waiting for this guy to show up, and I'm going, even if he does show up, I have no idea who he is. So what do? I go right onto LinkedIn, pull up his profile, pull up a picture of him, and yeah, he walks in the door and I know who he is. I can stand up and greet him and introduce myself. Now, he'd done the same thing to me, so we walked right over because he saw my picture on LinkedIn as well. But that's that highly connected world. We've got access to people and information, which means that we also rely on people's goodwill and trust. So if I'm looking at somebody in LinkedIn, or if I'm looking them up through other social media, why am I doing that? Am I doing it for a business reason, or am I trolling them? Am I trying to find some dirt on them that I might want to use? Now, personally, I don't do that kind of thing, but others might. And again, we're dealing in a very interconnected world. Everybody is linked to everybody else. And in order for this to work in a business context, we need to be civil with each other, both in person and online. And we see some of the implications of that with our kids when we look at cyberbullying and the challenges we have with cyberbullying now, where people are attacked anonymously through their peers at school. Well, that's really no different than attacking somebody at work through cyberspace. And it's, again, something we need to be civil about. We need to be civil with each other online. So some of the advantage of dealing with difficult people, or being civil with people, really, is that it is a huge advantage when you're dealing with difficult people and difficult personalities. We all deal with people who, quite frankly, we just don't get on well with. We don't get along with them. But how do we do that? We do that by being civil with them. We do it by not allowing them to push our buttons. Right? So by being civil, by being courteous with people, we set a stage for creating a really good and effective communication environment. And we reduce the potential for conflict. So we set boundaries for ourselves, we set boundaries for what other people, and if somebody crosses that boundary with us, we can be very civil about it and say, I'm sorry, I'm very uncomfortable with what you've just done, and I would appreciate it if you would not do that in the future. And that's a very civil response to something which may be a boundary which somebody has crossed with you. Civility also creates a positive atmosphere for people to see, one, their own behavior and the implications of others' behavior as well. So being civil with people, providing a professional work environment, helps support an organization and helps support people's interactions, and also helps to create empathy within the organization. Because if someone's constantly attacking you, for instance, and you are not rising to that attack, but you're responding in a very calm manner, you're responding in a way which is encouraging that person to maybe take a step back, you're encouraging that person to build empathy. And that has a great effect moving forward in the organization as well. So what causes incivility in a workplace? Well, certainly a lack of self-restraint. You know, I'm an emotional person. I can guarantee you that everybody that's on this webinar are also emotional people, because we're human beings. Now, how we deal with our emotions, how we restrain ourselves, you know, how we deal with that fight or flight that fight or flight complex that we all have when something gets really heated, and how do we react to that? Well, we need to be able to put not filters on what we're saying, but we need to be able to express our emotions in a way that is constructive, and express our emotions clearly, not allow things to really push our buttons where we act instinctively. When we're acting instinctively, it's usually out of something which is acting in anger or something which has upset us. So take the half second or so that you have to slow down, form a response, and again, be civil with people. Another cause of incivility, and this really hits to the online side of our world right now, is anonymity. The challenge with this is that people are tending to say things online because they're anonymous, right? They post something, nobody knows them, they can post it anonymously, they can say things about another person without actually, you know, having to take personal responsibility for it. So if you're sending out an instant message, or you're sending out a text, or you're sending out an email to somebody, any post to social media, there's a couple of tests. Would you be willing and comfortable saying it to that person if you were one-on-one with them in the same room? Not just face-to-face, but if you were one-on-one with this person, would you be comfortable saying it to that person? Would you be comfortable saying it to that person in a crowd of people so that others could hear what you were saying? Right? These are good tests that we all should be using on social media. Not just to blindly attack, but to say, okay, you know, am I attacking somebody, or am I trying to provide input to a conversation? So attacking somebody is a cause of incivility in organizations as well, and certainly stress. I live in a city which has an average house price of $1.27 million. $1.27 million. I don't know a lot of people that I work with that can buy a house for that kind of money. So people are commuting. They're spending more and more time in their cars trying to get into work, all for the same pay. Accidents happen. I see a lot more accidents on the roads. It's just a fact of life. You know, people come into work. I've got one colleague who drives in. It takes them half an hour to get into work, maybe 40 minutes, but it takes them up to 2 hours to get home. And that level of stress does not do this person any good. So, you know, as an organization, one of the organizations I work with, again, my day job, is we have a huge focus on work-life balance to try and make it palatable for people to have enough time off so that they can deal with the stresses of longer commutes, more time spent away from home, etc. But stress is a huge cause of bad behavior, incivil behavior. Building a civil workplace also helps the organization. It helps organization reduce costs and increase revenues. There were some surveys back in 2003 of workplace civility that a number of companies over a 5-year period, and having a civil workplace, it showed that a worker's strong positive emotions, so again, positive emotions, civil workplace, correlate with financial success of the company or the organization. Better customer return. You've got people who are willing to work with each other, who are civil with each other. That's also going to work outside your organization. because you're going to create a loyal market base with people. Your people internally are working together to deliver. That's going to create loyalty within your customers, and you're going to keep your customers, and you're not going to have these higher retention costs and acquisition costs. And company branding, which goes hand in hand with all of this. So if you're a good company to work with, you're a good company, you're seen as a good company, that's a good brand. That's a good thing to have, and that's the best advertising you can get. Oh yeah, I know that company. They're really great to work with. That's the strongest thing that any customer can say for you. They said, oh, they're great to work with. Well, maybe I'll give them a call. Maybe they can help me too. So there is rewards for civility as well. So how do we maintain civil behavior in a workplace? Well, again, we come back to creating, communicating, and also enforcing policies on civil behavior. And we'll talk a bit more about this point in a minute. When we're hiring people, we're trying to screen people for tendencies towards uncivil behavior. And quite frankly, when I'm hiring people, I type their name into Google and see what comes up online. And, you know, some people might say, well, you're trolling them. No, I'm trying to find out what type of person they are. And if there's something, if they have a history of really abusive online and social media habits, I'll still have a chat with them. I'll still talk to them, but I'll find out why. I won't discount them necessarily for that. But when I'm hiring people, I'm hiring them for cultural fit. They need to fit within the organization. And again, the day job that I have is a fairly unique organization. And cultural fit is really important. As long as people have the basic talent and the basic skills to do the job, I can train them to the nuances of what I need them to do, as long as they fit within the organization. And you know, most organizations now are looking at cultural fit as really the basic requirement to get somebody in the door. Especially in technology, there's a lot of really good technology people out there, but if they don't fit within an organization, then it's not going to work in the longer term. Maintaining civil behavior is also about continuous education, and it's also about formal training on civility. How do we train people to be civil? What does it actually mean? How do you train people to deal with difficult conversations with coworkers? How do you train people to deal with situations where a boundary has been crossed? Part of the training is when you get older. I think we get better at this with age. I know that either I'm getting better at it with age, or I'm practicing it more as I deal with more and more people. But it is something you can train people on. Look and practice self-assessments, and also ask other people for their opinions on how you're dealing with others. How do they see your actions? How do they see your interactions with people? Do they see you as being a civil person? And do they see that you basically practice what you're trying to preach? And increase accountability and transparency in the company and in the organization. So if people say something, they need to be held to account for what they said. If they've done something, they need to be held to account for what they've done, both positive and negative. And then the organization needs to be transparent. So if there's a lot of secrets and there's a lot of things that are being kept from employees or kept from staff or kept from management, that doesn't bode well for an organization, because it's creating an atmosphere where people aren't quite sure of what's going on. Now, there's always going to be some information, of course, that cannot be shared because of the sensitive nature of business, etc. But you know, transparency about operations, transparency about strategy, transparency about, you know, where the company is going, how things are performing, how people are performing. All of this helps to maintain and promote civil behavior in an organization. And again, remember, what we're talking about civil behavior here, the more civil behavior we have in an organization, the more likely we're going to be able to avoid conflict from happening, because that is the bottom line of what we're trying to deal with here, is conflict management. But it comes back to how people work together and how they deal with each other. So if you don't have a civility policy within your organization, I would urge you to create one. And it doesn't have to be a massively complex process document. But if you have a policy manual, then you reduce the potential for misunderstanding about what is civil behavior and what is unacceptable or uncivil behavior. So write it down, put it in a policy manual. if you're starting from scratch and you're creating a civility manual, or you're creating a policy manual, you start off by defining basic principles. So start off with even if you're with a group of HR professionals or your group of managers working together, then look at what you're trying to do. So, we want to talk about behaviors, we want to talk about language, we want to talk about gestures, we want to talk about cultural differences, etc. And the policy should be specific about what an unacceptable behavior is. And there needs to be measures that are put in place about those behaviors. So the example given here is about racial slurs in the workplace. And the measure is at a single instance of a racial slur in the workplace is grounds for disciplinary action. And that is the first part of documenting what's in the policy manual. A single instance, so it's measurable, of a racial slur in the workplace is ground for disciplinary action. Now, hopefully you won't have to get down to the minutia to define what a racial slur is. It may be that you will have to, depending on the organization, but you'll also need to define what those disciplinary actions are, and we'll touch more on this in a minute. The thing with unacceptable behavior, though, you need to be able to observe it, and you have to be able to measure it. So, as the slide says, thinking hateful thoughts is not a behavior. And it's not something that you can put in a policy. How can you tell what somebody is thinking? And if somebody says, "Oh no, I can tell what you're thinking," no, they can't, and not unless they're the single unique instance of documented extrasensory perception that's out there in the world. It needs to be measurable and it needs to be observable, and that's what a behavior is. So define what the consequences are. So if you breach the behavior, right, a single instance of a racial slur is subject to disciplinary action. What is the disciplinary action that will result as a breach of that policy within the organization? So they can be a simple reprimand. It can be sensitivity training. That might be appropriate. And for a single instance, now what happens if they repeat? So what is the escalation process if there's another instance of this particular behavior? Would it be up to and including dismissal possibly? And that depends on your organization, it depends on your structure, depends on your union environment, depends on management, depends on many potential areas. But the challenge is you have to document this. What is the escalation policy? And you need to stick and implement the escalation policy fairly across the organization. You can't be seen to be, giving somebody a pass and then punishing somebody else for the same behavior. So it needs to be fair and it needs to be equitable as well. Now, of course, when you're defining the escalation process and you're defining the consequences, all of this must abide by any local laws and regulations that you have to deal with wherever you're located, whatever country, whatever state, province, whatever. So always be sure to have the check and balance with that, and this is critical, because the last thing you want to do is get sued for something which is actually against the law in terms of a breach or a consequence of a policy. All right, so that's the issue around civility, and I'm hoping that you can make the connection that the more civil we are in the workplace, the less likely we're going to have to actually implement a conflict resolution process. But it will happen, and it will still happen. So there's a 6-step process which I'm going to touch on and identify. We'll talk about each of these in turn, about creating an effective atmosphere, create mutual understanding, focus on individual shared needs, get to the root cause, generate options, and build a solution. We'll touch on these a little bit in the remaining time that we've got. So create an effective atmosphere. We want to create a positive atmosphere where we can turn negative energy into something which is a problem-solving force. And this creates a very strong beginning for a resolution. So how do you create an effective atmosphere? One of the big things, if people are in a heated conflict, in a very emotional conflict, you need to diffuse the situation, first of all. And diffusing might just be simply scheduling some time at a later time or a later date to get all the parties together to document what the issues are that creates a better atmosphere than trying to deal with it then and there. Unless, of course, you literally have to deal with it then and there, but you try and find a way to diffuse a situation and build something which is certainly not a blame environment. We want to create an environment where people are comfortable to listen to each other, and people are going to listen to each other, and it may mean that you bring in a third-party facilitator to deal with this. So you've created an atmosphere, you've got people talking, and you're facilitating this to make sure that it's not becoming, well, you said, and that becomes a blame game. The next thing you're trying to do is to create some kind of a mutual understanding. Find out what each person needs. What do you need? What are you trying to accomplish? What is the, you want to do this in a particular way. I understand that need. The other person in a conflict or their organization, and you want to do this in this particular way. This is your particular need. Where do these needs intersect? This is where you start creating that mutual understanding. So I understand what another group needs. They understand what I need. And through that shared understanding, we start creating an environment. We start creating the possibility for conflict resolution, which is win-win and mutual gain. And this is what we're trying to always work towards, is cooperation and this win-win scenario. So creating an understanding lays the groundwork for this. And it's important that we get people to put themselves in other people's shoes, understand where they're coming from, understand why that's important to them. So then the focus, once these needs are identified, is again the common ground. So discussing the common ground. And as a facilitator in this process, you'll be looking for people to find anything, any piece of common ground that you can start to work with, right? And you build on that, and you build on that common area, and you build positive energy, and you start to ask people, how do you think another group could accomplish something? How does this other group think you could accomplish something? Find ways of getting people to work together to help build a partnership and then help strengthen that partnership as well. In any conflict and in any conflict situation, there's likely to be a single root cause. And there are a number of tools that are available in the workplace that you can do for root cause analysis. I won't go into those today, but you need to dive down and find out what that root cause, and you need to be able to address that root cause. So it may be something as simple as a personality conflict, or something as simple as a pay disparity between two people in the same position. One person might be making a lot more money than the other person, and they don't see why. And that's something that can be addressed in an organization. That's a trivial example, but it can be very powerful for people as well. The other thing about getting to root cause is the more you dig into a situation, the more you might identify other issues that may not have actually come to the surface yet. And by digging and digging and digging until you actually get to what is fundamentally the root of the conflict, you start to expose this, and you start to get people to understand that there are other areas that we need to deal with. And again, if you've created this mutual understanding, you've got focus on the issues, and you've got a good positive atmosphere, then building that solution and working together helps to help build the relationship and helps you build a better working arrangement. Generating options. Once you identify the root cause and you've identified all the pieces around this, you start looking for ways to resolve what needs to be fixed, right? What are all the options? And you're not just focusing on quality of options, focus on a ton of options. What are every possible thing we could do to address this conflict? Every possible thing we could do to deal with this issue and get it resolved. So that's just purely generating options. So this is a typical brainstorming exercise. People put stuff up, there's no evaluation, there's no deleting anything, all the options are valid, and then you go through and you start building a solution from those options. So you build a solution that requires that First of all, you need to know what the criteria for the solution is. So again, you're going back to, what is the understanding, what are the individual needs, what are the options, and you start shortlisting those options to find something suitable for the people involved, but also suitable for the organization and suitable for your customers, right? Because you always have to take this back to, who are we there to service? We're there to service our customers. So we're now building a solution. We're keeping people engaged in this. And you, if you're facilitating this, you're not building the solution. You're documenting the solution that you're getting others to build for you. Again, it's not a dictatorial process. It's a very collaborative process to get to something which is mutually beneficial. So that takes us through the steps of the process and at a very, very high level. And there's a lot more depth to this, of course. But let's talk in the last few minutes here about conflict resolution strategy versus process. So the process is the steps you take, and that's what we've just gone through, those 6 steps of a conflict resolution process. And I'll repeat those at the end of the webinar. But a strategy supports the process in giving you different ways to manage that conflict situation. And there's a model called the Thomas Kilmann instrument, the TKI model, which basically graphs out different strategies for dealing with conflict based on an assertiveness and cooperativeness scale. So if we start in the top right corner, the most effective strategy for dealing with conflict is collaborating. If you're collaborating with somebody that you're in conflict with, you are working well with them, you understand their needs, they understand your needs, and you're both willing, or both parties are willing, to work towards a mutually beneficial solution, the ultimate win-win solution. So if we go across and we go to the highly assertive but least cooperative situation, then you've got competition and conflict. So this is a win-lose scenario, right? And this is a conflict resolution strategy which may have some place if you're buying a car, a used car, perhaps. But in the business workplace, win-lose is not typically a strategy I would recommend. But it is part of what people do as well. So as we start to drop down the assertiveness scale, we start to get into other types of strategies that we can use. Certainly compromising, which sits right in the middle of the TKI model. And compromising means that one party or both parties compromise somewhat on what they truly want. Now, if you think about compromise as a not a regularly used strategy, it can be effective. But if you're always having to compromise what you want to satisfy somebody else, you're actually not dealing with the root cause of conflict, and something is still going to be simmering underneath. And you're going to likely move from compromising to competing. And that becomes a challenge. So compromising is, again, something which, to get past an issue, it might be a suitable strategy, but again, not something which you should be using all the time. Certainly, if we go to the bottom left and avoiding conflict, just saying, hey, I'm not in conflict here, it's okay, we're just going to move on, nothing to see here, just keep going, and we just pretend that conflict doesn't exist. That is a strategy. I'm not certain that it's going to be a very effective strategy for very long. There's very few instances where this might be appropriate, and it only may be appropriate if you're coming to the end of a very complex project and people are getting highly stressed, and you sort of ignore what's going on and just hope you can get to the end. I still think that collaboration in that respect would be a much better policy, but it depends on the individuals, depends on the time frame, depends on the nature of where you are in your business cycles. And last but not least, so highly cooperative but very unassertive is the strategy of accommodating. And accommodating more than compromising is accommodating to somebody else's views and just basically subordinating what you want to have to whatever somebody else wants to do. And just saying, okay, fine, we'll do it your way, I don't care. And if you keep hearing that, If you have to keep doing that with an organization, then you probably don't care. And if you don't care about conflict management and conflict resolution, that means you're probably not going to be staying in the organization that much longer. Or and if you hear that from your staff, if you're always accommodating to somebody else's needs and desires, they're probably not going to stay either. And this is really where you can get into some management discussions and some leadership discussions. You know, I'm always doing what my boss tells me. He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't listen to my opinions. Well, you know, that's a decision, and that's setting up a situation and setting up a scenario where potentially it's not the best place to be. Anyways, that's a very brief overview of some of the strategies you can use. And again, I'm always going towards the top right, always looking for the collaborating strategies. At worst, I'm trying to move towards compromising if needed, but really trying to get to a collaborative solution, which is the ultimate win-win goal of conflict management. So just a quick summary. What causes conflicts? Well, people and organizational issues, personality clashes, stress, cultural differences, certainly in the personality side, management, policies and procedures, workload, unmanaged change for the sake of change's sake without any good change management policies and processes in place. All of these cause conflict because they all cause stress within the workplace. Being civil, conflict, as I said, is unavoidable, is inevitable, it's unavoidable. But building this atmosphere of civility, you know, and again, you're not going to avoid conflict, but building a civil atmosphere helps work towards that ultimate collaborative strategy for dealing and managing conflict. So build the atmosphere of civility within your organization. The 6-step process to conflict resolution, creating an effective atmosphere to deal with the conflict, create mutual understanding, make sure people understand each other's sides of the story, focus on the individual and shared needs between both sides of the conflict, try and find out what the root cause is, dig down until you find out what is fundamentally causing this. Generate tons of options on how to deal with this. There's always more than one option. And from those options, build a solution which is in the best way collaborative in nature and is a win-win for everybody involved, so that we're not getting into the compromising and accommodating part of this TKI model, but we're into more collaborating, which is essentially where we're always trying to get to. So conflict management in the workplace, certainly something which we all need to do, certainly something which we all need to be practiced on and trained on. And with that, I will wish you the very, very best for the holiday season. And hopefully you won't have too much conflict to deal with. Thank you. So back to you, Kara.
Thank you, Brian. If anybody has questions, please type them in now. While you are typing questions, I'd like to remind you to please reach out to your local contact for more information or visit us at newhorizons.com. Okay, Brian, we do have one question.
Okay.
How do you manage an individual and his or her interaction with coworkers when they tend to stir up trouble constantly?
That's an extraordinarily relevant question, because in this case you're observing two people in your team and someone that likes to cause trouble. Well, I think in the first instance it's a one-on-one discussion about conflict with that person. If that person is stirring up trouble, you sit down and have a discussion with them and be very transparent about the behavior that you're observing in this person. And again, if you look at a conflict resolution strategy, you can apply it to this one person. Then this one person really is you're creating an atmosphere where you're trying to be transparent and understand what causes this behavior in this person. You're trying to find out what their needs are. You're trying to find out what the root cause of the behavior is. Why is this person always trying to stir up trouble? What is there some underlying problem this person has with management, or what is the actual root cause of the issue? Find ways of trying to address it with this person. And again, coming up with options about how behaviors need to be changed, and come to some agreed on solution to this. So we can always fall back on this process and modify it to deal with an individual as well. And I think really the biggest part in this case when dealing with observed behavior is trying to find out the root cause of it, because that could actually, again, open up a lot more information that may be hidden or maybe simmering below the surface within the team.
Thank you, Brian. We have a couple more. How do you handle a lazy coworker that does not pull their own weight and their customers contact myself to take care of things for them that the lazy coworker should be handling? It adds stress to me trying to get my own workload done, let alone working on a coworker's project because they're not available or have disappeared.
Yeah, no, yeah, fair comment. And this is again, part of an example we talked about, which is, you've got one group which is pulling their weight and one group that's not, and it comes down to the individual. And this is again a source of conflict. So if this is happening, this should be escalated to your manager to deal with. But again, if you're escalating a conflict to your manager, what you're trying to present is facts. And you need to be very clear and very emotionally intelligent with yourself to say, okay, these are the facts of what I believe have happened or what I am seeing happen. These are what I'm hearing from the customer, and I would have that discussion first one-on-one with the manager, and and allow your manager leader to explore this, to find out what's going on. And at that point, it's really incumbent on them to deal with your colleague and deal with your coworker to find out, again, what the root cause of their behavior is, and also put in place performance management tools to change that behavior. It's really difficult for you to deal with that situation one-on-one if you're both at the same level. It really needs to have a management presence or a leadership presence or a facilitation presence anyways, which typically in organizations would go to the manager or leader of the organization.
Thank you, Brian. A couple more. How do you break down someone who starts off a meeting on a hostile note, talking in a sarcastic manner, making up obstacles, things like that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've been in meetings, and I'll speak from personal experience on this, where situations like that have happened. People come into a meeting and they're hot. They're just generally hot under the collar. They start off by blaming people, blaming situations, and everything is about how wrong it is and how bad it is. If I'm in those meetings, I will stop. I will actually interrupt the person. I will stop them respectfully if I can, and I will just remind them that we're in a meeting to resolve issues, to discuss a particular agenda, discuss a particular problem, a particular challenge with the customer, and we should be looking at this from a perspective of how do we make this work together rather than just attacking people. And if that's not going to work, then I'm sorry, I'm going to excuse myself from the meeting. And when you want to talk about something constructively, let me know, and I'll be happy to work with you. It's a bit harsh, but it needs to be very direct and very clear that you're not going to put up with that behavior, and you need to remove yourself from that situation. You'll also find that people around the room will typically support you in this, if you can say it professionally, and if you can remove and manage your own emotions when you're saying it. And that's something which you need to be quite cautious with on that particular situation as well.
Thank you, Brian. And we have just one more that I just lost. Basically, it was, is it a good idea to take somebody to lunch to understand the root cause of a problem?
Could be. I can't say yes or no to that. Really, it depends on the situation. But it's again, if you're trying to create an atmosphere, and again, if you get down to the first step of a conflict resolution process, moving to a neutral situation, take them out for lunch somewhere where you can have a good chat outside of the office environment, situationally dependent, but yeah, it could work. Yeah.
All right, I think that is all we have for today. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you everybody for attending.
It's been my absolute pleasure, Kara. Thank you.
Thanks.